On an ordinary morning in Omaha, Nebraska, nothing appeared unusual. The sun rose over miles of steel track. Freight cars rolled in on schedule. Engines idled, coupled, and moved on, just as they had every day for generations. For decades, this rail yard had operated with a kind of mechanical certainty, quiet, disciplined, and predictable. To most Americans, it was invisible. To the Midwest, it was essential. For more than a century, this rail yard operated by Union Pacific functioned as a silent command center. Corn, soybeans, grain, ethanol, and manufactured goods passed through its switches and signals, shaping how the American heartland fed cities hundreds of miles away. Thousands of workers reported for shifts, knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like: steady hours, stable paychecks, and a future that felt reliably mapped out. On that morning, nothing felt wrong. There were no sirens, no emergency meetings, no headlines breaking across national news. The trains kept moving, the schedules held. From the outside, the system looked unchanged, but inside the operation, something fundamental had already shifted. Decisions made far from the tracks had quietly altered the role of human labor in one of the most critical logistics hubs in the country. Over time, thousands of jobs tied to this rail yard would disappear, not all at once, not dramatically, but methodically. Positions, once filled by experienced workers, were redefined, consolidated, or removed altogether. The work did not stop. The rail yard did not close. Instead, it evolved into something more efficient, more automated, and far less dependent on people. For a region that had built generations of stability around this single employer, the change did not arrive like a collapse. It arrived like silence noticed only after it had already settled in. If a rail yard that once controlled the Midwest can lose thousands of jobs without ever shutting down, what does stability really mean anymore? For much of the 20th century, this rail yard was not just another industrial site, it was a cornerstone of the American logistics system. Operated by Union Pacific, the facility in Omaha grew alongside the nation's expansion westward, quietly scaling to meet the demands of farms, factories, and cities across the Midwest. Over more than 100 years, its role became so embedded in daily commerce that few questioned whether it could ever change. Physically, the scale was immense. The rail yard stretched across hundreds of acres, with miles of parallel track designed to sort, assemble, and dispatch freight with precision. On any given day, thousands of rail cars passed through, loaded with agricultural commodities, industrial inputs, and finished goods bound for markets far beyond Nebraska. This was not a regional spur. It was a hub whose reach extended across multiple states and entire regions, shaping delivery timelines and pricing structures nationwide. The workforce reflected that scale. At its peak, thousands of employees, engineers, conductors, yardmasters, maintenance crews kept the operation moving around the clock. Many spent decades in the same roles, mastering processes that depended on human judgment as much as machinery. The rail yard offered something increasingly rare in modern America: long-term stability in a sector that rewarded experience and consistency. Its importance was also strategic. By sitting at a crossroads of east-west and north-south routes, the facility functioned as a control point for supply chains, feeding major population centers. When crops left Midwest farms, this rail yard often determined how quickly and at what cost they reached processors, ports, and consumers. For logistics planners, it was assumed to be permanent infrastructure, as fixed and dependable as the rails themselves. That assumption shaped expectations. Local leaders viewed the yard as untouchable. Workers believed the skills they had built would always be needed. Communities trusted that this engine of employment and commerce would continue to anchor the region, just as it had for generations. In hindsight, that certainty was not a guarantee. It was an inherited belief, passed down from an era when scale and human labor were inseparable, and few noticed how quietly that belief was beginning to erode. For generations, the city surrounding this rail yard did not simply host a major employer, that it organized daily life around it. In Omaha, work schedules followed train movements. Shift changes shaped traffic patterns. Paydays determined when shops were busiest and when restaurants stayed open late. The rail yard was woven into the rhythm of the community in ways that rarely made headlines but quietly sustained normal life. Families planned their futures around local railroad jobs. Parents bought homes knowing the work was steady. Children grew up expecting that employment at the yard would be there when they were old enough. The promise was not wealth, but predictability, a dependable income, health coverage, and the sense that tomorrow would look much like today. Over time, that predictability became a shared assumption rather than a spoken agreement. An ecosystem formed around this stability. Small businesses, auto repair shops, diners, equipment suppliers, trucking services relied on workers whose livelihoods traced back to the rail yard. Local schools benefited from a tax base anchored by long-term employment. Municipal budgets reflected years of consistency, not sudden spikes or collapses. The community did not feel prosperous in a flashy way, but it felt secure. What made this arrangement powerful was its duration. Many workers spent 20, 30, even 40 years connected to the same operation. Experience was valued. Institutional knowledge mattered. The rail yard rewarded familiarity with its systems, its rules, and its pace. In return, it offered something increasingly scarce in the modern economy: a stable path that did not require constant relocation or reinvention. This long period of continuity shaped how people understood risk. Few prepared for sudden disruption because none had occurred within living memory. The rail yard had weathered recessions, industry shifts, and technological upgrades before always adapting without breaking its bond with the workforce. That history reinforced the belief that whatever changed elsewhere, this place would endure. By the time automation began to alter how the yard functioned, the foundation of trust was already decades old. And when that foundation started to weaken, the impact would not be limited to individual workers. It would ripple outward, touching homes, businesses, and institutions that had grown accustomed to one central truth: this employer was permanent. For the people who worked here, the change did not arrive as a single moment. There was no announcement that emptied lockers overnight, no dramatic scene of gates closing. Instead, the impact unfolded gradually, position by position, shift by shift, until the reality became impossible to ignore. Jobs that had once been passed down, or held for decades, were quietly reclassified or eliminated. Consider a worker nearing retirement after 30 years on the yard. The expectation had always been clear: finish out a career, secure benefits, and step away with dignity. Automation altered that timeline. Roles that depended on human judgment were replaced by systems that never called in sick and never asked for overtime. The worker was not fired in a single stroke. The position simply ceased to exist. The promise of a predictable final chapter vanished. For younger families, the pressure looked different, but felt just as heavy. Many had taken on mortgages during years when railroad paychecks were considered among the most reliable in the region. Those decisions were made carefully, based on long-term employment that had already proven itself across generations. When hours were reduced or roles disappeared, financial planning built on certainty had to be rewritten almost overnight. The loss extended beyond income. Healthcare coverage, once a given, became uncertain. Benefits tied to full-time roles no longer applied in the same way. Families who had never worried about medical costs suddenly faced choices they had never planned for. The stability that had defined railroad work eroded not through crisis, but through accumulation. One adjustment, one policy change, one eliminated role at a time. What made this shift especially disorienting was its emotional texture. There was no clear moment to react against, no single decision to protest. The rail yard remained open. Trains still moved. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. Yet for those inside the system, the ground had shifted. The loss was not just financial. It was the disappearance of predictability, the quiet assurance that tomorrow could be planned with confidence. For decades, railroad work had offered a contract that extended beyond wages. It promised continuity in a world increasingly defined by volatility. As automation reshaped that promise, workers were left navigating uncertainty without the sense of collective transition that usually accompanies change. The work continued, but the certainty that once surrounded it did not. What made the shift feel like a betrayal was not the presence of change, but the absence of warning. In the years leading up to automation, the rail yard appeared stable, by every visible measure. There were announcements about modernization. There were upgrades to systems and infrastructure. Capital investments totaling hundreds of millions of dollars were framed as commitments to long-term operations, not signals of workforce reduction. To workers and local officials, these moves suggested continuity. Modern equipment was understood as a way to support human labor, not replace it. Training programs emphasized adaptation. Public messaging focused on safety, efficiency, and competitiveness. The language never implied that the core relationship between the employer and its workforce was about to be rewritten. Behind the scenes, however, the timeline was already set. Automation does not require dramatic closures to be effective. It works incrementally, one system at a time, one function absorbed into software, one role rendered redundant by design. By the time the impact became visible on payrolls, the decisions had already been locked in. What deepened the sense of betrayal was how quietly it unfolded. There was no broad notification to communities that depended on these jobs. No extended runway for workers to plan transitions. In many cases, the realization arrived only after schedules changed or positions were quietly removed from the roster. The rail yard did not collapse. It simply stopped needing as many people. This gap between expectation and outcome created a rupture of trust. For decades, stability had been reinforced through action, steady employment, incremental growth, visible investment. Automation reversed that narrative without ever openly challenging it. The message that workers received was not explicit, but unmistakable. The future had already been decided elsewhere. What lingered was not anger, but disorientation. The belief that this place would always provide work had not been disproven by failure. It had been undone by efficiency. And for those who had built their lives around that belief, the realization came too late to prepare. The transformation of this rail yard cannot be traced back to a single decision or a single force. There was no moment when one lever was pulled and thousands of jobs vanished. Instead, the change emerged from overlapping pressures that reshaped how freight rail operates in modern America. Not one cause, but many. At the center was costs. Railroads operate on thin margins, where small efficiency gains compound across millions of miles and shipments. Over time, expenses tied to labor, energy, maintenance, and regulatory compliance rose steadily. Each additional employee represented not just wages, but long-term obligations benefits, scheduling complexity, and training. Automation promised something the industry increasingly valued: predictability in spending. Energy and utilities added another layer of pressure. Fuel prices fluctuated, power demands increased as yards grew more technologically complex. Automated systems offered tighter control over consumption, reducing waste and smoothing operational variability. Where human-driven processes could vary shift by shift, software enforced uniformity. Then there was logistics. Modern supply chains reward speed, consistency, and precision. Agricultural producers across the Midwest needed rail service that could meet exact timing windows tied to processing, storage, and export schedules. Automation enabled tighter coordination between yards, terminals, and long-haul routes. Fewer delays meant fewer idle assets and fewer people required to manage exceptions. The structure of the rail industry itself also changed. Competitive pressure pushed operators to move more freight with fewer touch points. Yard operations were redesigned to minimize manual switching and reduce dwell time. Systems that once relied on experience accumulated over decades were rewritten into algorithms that could optimize flows in real time. The work did not disappear. It migrated into code. Labor markets played a role as well. Recruiting and retaining skilled rail workers became more challenging as younger generations pursued different paths. Automation was framed as a solution to workforce shortages, even as it reduced the total number of positions available. This feedback loop reinforced itself. Fewer workers justified more automation, which in turn reduced the need for workers. Consumer behavior completed the picture. Americans expected faster deliveries, lower prices, and uninterrupted availability standards set by an economy increasingly defined by immediacy. To meet those expectations, logistics providers optimized relentlessly. Railroads, once buffered by long timelines and seasonal rhythms, adapted to a world where delay carried visible financial penalties. None of these forces acted alone. Together, they created an environment where automation was not just attractive, but inevitable. Importantly, this shift did not signal failure. Freight volumes continued. The rail yard remained operational. In many metrics, performance improved. But improvement came with trade-offs that were not evenly distributed. What made this transition difficult to recognize was its neutrality. There was no villain, no single policy to point to, no dramatic collapse. Decisions were framed as rational responses to market conditions. Each step made sense in isolation. Taken together, they redefined what it meant to operate a critical piece of national infrastructure. By the time the consequences were visible to workers and communities, the logic behind them was already deeply embedded. Automation did not arrive to replace people outright. It arrived to optimize systems, and in doing so, it quietly changed the role of human labor within the backbone of American freight. The effects of automation at this rail yard did not stop at the edge of the tracks. They moved outward, quietly, through the systems that connect producers, distributors, and consumers across the country. When a logistics hub in the Midwest changes how it operates, the consequences extend far beyond the local workforce. For agricultural producers, the shift altered timing and coordination. Rail schedules became more rigid, optimized for system-wide efficiency rather than local flexibility. Grain and crop shipments were slotted into predefined windows, leaving less room to absorb disruptions caused by weather or seasonal fluctuations. While automation improved predictability on paper, it also reduced the margin for adjustment on the ground. These changes affected prices in subtle ways. Delays measured in hours or days compounded across long distances, influencing storage costs, processing timelines, and contract penalties. Each additional constraint added friction to supply chains, already stretched across multiple states. The costs did not remain within the rail industry. They moved downstream. Manufacturers and processors adjusted by holding more inventory or seeking alternative routes, both of which carried added expense. Over time, these costs filtered into wholesale pricing. By the time goods reached store shelves, the impact appeared disconnected from its source. Consumers saw higher prices or reduced availability without realizing that part of the explanation traced back to decisions made in a rail yard hundreds of miles away. Automation also changed resilience. Fewer people on the ground meant fewer opportunities to resolve unexpected issues in real time. Systems designed for efficiency performed well under normal conditions but struggled during disruptions. When delays occurred, recovery took longer because human intervention had been minimized by design. What looked like progress in stable periods revealed vulnerability under stress. For everyday Americans, the effect was indirect but real. Food prices edged upward, delivery timelines became less forgiving, supply chains felt more brittle, even as they appeared more advanced. The rail yard continued to function, but its relationship to the broader economy had shifted from flexible backbone to optimized conduit. Most consumers never traced these outcomes back to automation decisions or workforce reductions. They experienced the results as background noise in daily life, slightly higher bills, occasional shortages, and less tolerance for disruption. In this way, the transformation of one rail yard quietly touched millions of people who never knew its name. What unfolded in this rail yard was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader pattern reshaping freight rail across the United States. Similar transitions appeared at major hubs operated by BNSF Railway and CSX Transportation, where automation and precision-driven operations steadily reduced the need for large on-site workforces. The names and locations differed, but the structure of change remained strikingly consistent. In logistics centers tied to ports, inland terminals, and crossroads like Chicago, investments followed the same logic. Fewer manual touchpoints, tighter scheduling, and systems designed to run continuously with minimal human intervention. None of these sites shut down. Trains still moved. Volumes often increased. Yet the role of people within these systems narrowed. The pattern was quiet by design. Automation rarely arrives with a single announcement. It appears as upgrades, software deployments, and operational refinements. Each step looks reasonable in isolation. Together, they redraw the employment map of an industry without ever triggering a clear moment of public reckoning. This consistency matters because it reframes the story. The transformation of one rail yard does not point to local mismanagement or isolated miscalculation. It reflects a national shift in how infrastructure is valued, measured less by the number of people it employs and more by how efficiently it moves goods. Across the country, stability once rooted in long-term jobs is being replaced by stability defined through optimized systems. Seen this way, the Midwest rail yard was not a warning sign. It was an early chapter. And the same forces that reshaped it continue to move, yard by yard, through the backbone of American logistics, largely unnoticed by the people who depend on it every day. At the end of the day, the rail yard in Omaha, Nebraska, still looks much the same. The tracks stretch toward the horizon. Freight cars sit in orderly lines. Signals flash and switch points adjust with mechanical precision. From a distance, nothing suggests loss. The system appears intact, efficient, controlled, and fully operational. What has changed is harder to see. Fewer people walk the yard. Fewer voices carry across the steel and gravel. The work continues, but it no longer depends on the same human presence that once defined it. Automation did not erase the rail yard. It redefined its relationship with the community that grew around it. For decades, stability meant something tangible. It meant showing up for a shift and knowing the job would still be there tomorrow. It meant building a life around work that rewarded time, experience, and commitment. That understanding shaped how families planned their futures and how entire regions understood economic security. Now, stability is measured differently. It lives in system uptime, in optimized schedules, in algorithms designed to minimize variation. These metrics make sense for a modern logistics network. They keep goods moving and costs controlled, but they leave an unanswered question hanging in the background, one that cannot be captured by efficiency reports or quarterly statements. The rail yard still moves the Midwest's freight. America's food and goods continue to travel across its tracks, yet the foundation beneath that movement has shifted. Stability, once anchored in people, has migrated into processes. The transition happened without closure, without collapse, and without ceremony. The yard did not fail. It evolved. And that evolution forces a quieter, more unsettling reflection, one that reaches beyond a single company or a single city. If something this foundational can change so completely without ever shutting down, what does stability really mean in America anymore?